Hello and welcome to the Tadat podcast, and a warm welcome to our audience members worldwide. Thank you for joining us this morning. On the Tadat podcast, we showcase countries' experiences with Tadat assessments and Tadat trainings. However, we also showcase countries' experiences and good practices in tax administration. Today's episode is one such case where we have Sweden joining us today, and we'll be discussing POA 3, which is Performance Outcome Area 3 and Supportive Voluntary Compliance. Joining us today is Deputy Director Catherine Baer from the Fiscal Affairs Department in the International Monetary Fund. Welcome, Catherine.
My pleasure to be here today, Annette, joining this Tadat podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us. And we also are privileged to have today from the Swedish Tax Agency, Anders Strid, who is a strategist and who has written the book that we'll be discussing today. Welcome to the podcast, Anders.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We'd like to remind our audience that we are open. We have the chats open on our YouTube channel, and you are more than welcome to please submit your questions. We have an open Q&A section at the end of today's intervention. And without much further ado, over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much again, Annette. And it's a real pleasure to host this today's podcast with Anders from the Swedish Tax Agency. I know that the agency has made a lot of changes over the years in support of voluntary compliance, and it's something that many tax administrations, or I would say most tax administrations around the world, are striving to do, and to find that ever-elusive balance between being credible with enforcement and also having good taxpayer services and viewing the taxpayer as a customer rather than a guilty party of non-compliance. So this episode really focuses on some of those issues and the Swedish Tax Agency's experience in addressing those over time, and in particular how the philosophy and the culture within the agency has changed, which is what makes this such an interesting case to discuss today. So Anders, let's hear from you. And also I want to mention that Anders and his colleague have written a very interesting book called From Feared Tax Collector to Popular Service Agency, which he will talk about today. And that will give us, I'm sure, some really interesting issues to discuss during this hour or so. So Anders, it's my pleasure to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I will share my screen and I will give you a presentation based on this journey. So just to make sure, can you see the screen now?
Yes, it looks good, Anders.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to give you a presentation about this change of the Swedish Tax Agency. And as you said, me and my colleague, Mr. Lennart Wittberg, we're authors to this book describing this change. And if we go back in time, well, the situation was not as good as it is today. I mean, we have a good relation with taxpayers nowadays. But if we go back in time, and we can see in studies, we did one study in 2003, where we asked taxpayers, what do you think of when you hear Skatteverket, which is the Swedish Tax Agency? And these are some of the responses we got. People thought about debt. Some thought about remorse, physical illness, a complicated language for ordinary people, complicated legislation, and what have I done wrong? And then in 2014, we did a similar study. We asked the taxpayers, what do you think of when you hear Skatteverket? And then people replied in another manner. They said that, well, think about nice treatment. I think about smooth, fast, and good service. I get help if I need it, refund, and waiting time in telephone. And even if these were kind of small studies that we made, we could see that it really reflects the general pattern that people tend to think when we look in the whole of society. If we look in more extensive studies that we have done and look when it comes to the level of trust, and when it comes to the perception of good treatment, there are some really big changes that happen. And to the left, you will see pillars, what it looked like in the year 2000. And approximately 50% of the taxpayers, they had trust in our institution at that time. And that has increased to over 70%, 75%. Nowadays, it's even higher compared between year 2000 and 2017. To the right, you see the pillars that describe the change when it comes to good treatment. It was less than 50% in the year 2000 that perceived a good treatment from us. But that has changed a lot. So in 2017, it's approximately 94%, and I think now it's 96% nowadays. So it's a drastic shift there. Our mission, by the way, has been more or less the same. It contains of these 3 bullet points you see on top of this slide. It has been for a long period of time: to safeguard the financing of the public sector, to contribute to the well-functioning of society for citizens, trade and industry, and to counteract criminal activities. And then a few years ago, we also have in our mission that citizens and companies should have trust in the Swedish tax agency's activities, and women and men should be given the same opportunities and conditions when contacting the authority. But even if the mission has been more or less the same, the way we have carried out the mission has changed a lot. So there is the change in itself. It's not a different mission from our Ministry of Finance. It's the change within more or less the same mission. And in 2011, we got a prize at the Swedish Tax Agency in the Swedish society, and we were selected the most modern government agency. And the jury's motivation was that the Swedish Tax Agency has changed from being a feared tax collector to becoming a well-liked service organization. They said that development has been persistent and focused, and service and treatment of taxpayers have improved. The culture of the organization has changed. And when we got this prize, colleagues from other agencies in the Swedish society, but also from other tax agencies, they asked us, but how have you done this kind of change? Have you, used some of these management methods that are so popular, or maybe you brought in some super consultant that twisted the minds of the staff of the Swedish tax agency to become more service oriented? But that has not been our case. What we have done is trying to listen to taxpayers, trying to understand what their situation is like. And we have brought this knowledge into the organization, and we have used this knowledge as a base for developing our strategy. And I would say that each time we have done studies like this to listen and understanding, we have been wrong ourselves. So we can have strong opinions within the organization, what we think it is to be a taxpayer. But when we really listen to the taxpayers, their point of view or their perspective gives always something extra. And when did this change start? Usually we go back to the 1970s when we describe this change. And at that period of time, we had a strong identity in the organization of being this enforcement agency. And by enforcement, we mean a culture of audits and checks, sort of that. And the taxpayer, as you introduced, when you made the introduction, Catherine, was seen as more or less the opponent. So we saw taxpayers as opponent, and they perhaps saw us as opponent as well. And the good result at that period of time was seen as when we use our enforcement activities, audit and checks, and we can collect more revenue after audit activities. The more checks we did, that was seen as a good result, and the more money we collected after audit activities, that was also seen as a good result. And what we did in the relation to the taxpayer was more that we tried to scare them into compliance. So we said that you should be aware, otherwise we will catch you and things can go bad for you. But something happened in the 1970s, and in the Swedish society, we have in Sweden at that period of time, we have had a very famous movie director, and his name was Ingmar Bergman. And we thought that the company he owned when he was producing his films and he was working at the theater, maybe he didn't, pay the right amount of tax. So we decided to go and get him to an interrogation about the tax situation. And we did this together with the police and the tax officials at that period of time. They had identical black leather coats that they had bought privately. So they entered the Royal Dramatic Theatre where he was rehearsing, and he saw these gentlemen coming in together with the police. And he said that, well, I understand that you have these powers, but the way you use these powers is not okay. So he was very angry with that. And that started the debate in the Swedish society. And the debate was, what is really the role of an agency in society? Is it okay to use your powers in this way? And the reaction from the political side was that this is not how agencies, no matter if it's a tax agency or other agency, should use their powers. So we are for the people, not against the people. So even if this was something that happened a long time ago, we still discuss this because what happens if we end up with activities like this one is that it's like a lose-lose situation. No one benefits from it. So it's about the legitimate power. If we continue, in the 1980s, we started to think more about service. But service was seen as something apart of the strong culture or identity of being this enforcement agency. So the staff was divided in service staff and enforcement staff. And we had separate goals for service and separate goals for like enforcement and audits. And still, when it comes to what this was really the good result in the organization would seen still when we collect a lot of tax revenue after audit activities. But we started to talk more about taxpayer rights, so that we also have to make sure that people could use their rights. And that started in the 1980s. And in 1990s, we had an idea to strike a balance between the resources we spent on enforcement activities and the resources we spent on service activities. You could say that service and enforcement came a little bit closer together, but the approach was still from within the tax agency. It was not from the taxpayer's perspective. So just to give you an example of how this approach really didn't work when it comes to reality, is what we had an enforcement activity where we wanted to see that those who had a rental income from owning a house, that they declared this income. And this was an activity we had on an island in Sweden. And people, the taxpayers, they could read in the newspaper before we did this activity that we were about to do it. So what happened? Well, what happened was that many taxpayers, they came to our office and they said that, well, I understand that you're going to do this enforcement activity, but it would be nice of you if you could explain to me how I can do it right. So that increased the demand for service. So we had from the head office at that time had to send more brochures, more forms, more support to taxpayers. But we realized that from the taxpayer's perspective, well, enforcement is something that we do, but also provide service. We had to look through everything. We can't divide it as we have done before. And in the beginning of year 2000, we sat down with lots of other tax agencies, mostly OECD countries, but also others, and we thought, what is really a good result for us? What are we really doing? And we came to the conclusion that a better result within the same mission is when we can get it right from the start. So if we could see that the taxpayers can use their rights, the tax returns that we receive, etc., they are correct in a larger extent, that is really the good result, not when we find as much errors as possible, which was the result we saw before. And then we started to look into what is really the reason for compliance. In the past, we looked more for reasons for non-compliance, and we worked a lot with the risks for non-compliance. I mean, we do that today as well, but we also look at the drivers, the motivation side. Why are people compliant? And we realize that trust is a key. Those who trust the Swedish tax agency, they are more willing to comply, but they also feel more welcome to use their rights. They feel that I can ask the Swedish tax agency my questions, and I feel that I am important, and they will answer. So trust, we realized that was an important oil in the machinery that we have to earn in order to get it right from the start. And we continued with this approach 2010 and forward, this right from the start approach, earning trust, but we use digitalization to put on top of our mindset, which was heavily influenced by seeing the world in processes, sequential. So we had a process for filing tax return, and then we use digitalization in order to create these e-services. So it's more or less the same. You can have a mailbox, you can have a digital mailbox, more or less the same, or a tax return or an e-tax return. And that has been something that has helped us, but that is not how we see it in the future. I will come back to that. I have never met an organization that says that, well, we are lucky because it's so simple for the taxpayers. Our legislation is so simple so everyone understands. So it's more or less, complicated for the taxpayers. So it's more or less complicated. And they live in a more like a complex environment. It's so much to consider. And what we think about this is that should be more our challenge, not the taxpayers' challenge. In the past, we put it on the shoulders of the taxpayers. We said that you can read on our website, and it was very extensive information, and people, they didn't really trust the information, so they went to someone else, like a tax agent, and they paid to get help with the filing of the tax return. And we asked ourselves, what did they really pay for? And we think that they paid for, in our situation, in our context, more that they didn't feel comfortable asking us about their tax situation. And that comes back to us. We have to change in order for them to be able to use their rights, which was according to the law. We have an obligation to provide service to taxpayers. So therefore, when we see that something is really hard or tough for the taxpayers, we think that should be our challenge firstly, not that we put it on the taxpayers. Then when it comes to the strategy and the strategic choices that we have made, we made a strategic choice back in 1998 that we wanted to increase the willingness to comply. And we think that each tax administration has to choose about what climate you want to support. Are you going for more this antagonistic climate that we had in the past? Is more coerced compliance, we threaten taxpayers, and enforcement in that scenario is more used as deterrence. So you should be aware that we will catch you if you're non-compliant, and that could cost you that kind of information or climate. And then people, they comply because they have to, or they feel that the tax agency is controlling the taxpayers into being compliant. We've chosen the other way, which is more the trust-based climate, but we still use enforcement. But we use enforcement in a way that supports trust and to understanding the norms that are in society. Just to give you an example, so I could say that, Catherine, we will find you if you're non-compliant, or we could say that, Catherine, we are going to do enforcement activities to make sure that you don't face unfair competition because others are non-compliant. We are still carrying out enforcement activity, but in a more supportive way. And we also want to give each and everyone an opportunity to be compliant before we use these enforcement activities. In that sense, it's something that we do for the taxpayers, not against the taxpayers. And in 2003, we did a study, and we wanted to know what attitudes taxpayers perceive that we have, and we wanted to know how these attitudes affected trust. And we knew at that period of time that trust is very important, that it's an important factor when it comes to creating this willingness to be compliant. And we got help from an external company doing this study, and we divided taxpayers into different groups. So we had the young taxpayer in one group, we had like older taxpayers, foreign taxpayers, small companies, etc. Different groups of taxpayers. Totally, it was done 84 in-depth interview, 1 hour each. This study was done with the help of psychologists and behavioral experts. And when the study was done, we had a meeting with this firm that helped us with the study, and they said that how you divided taxpayers didn't really match the attitudes they perceived. So it was as much difference between these groups as among the groups when it comes to perceived attitudes. So just to give you an example, one business owner, CEO at the business, he said that, well, when I get a letter from the tax agency or when I have interactions with the tax agency, I get this feeling in my stomach that, well, something is not right. It feels like, going back to school, you have to go to the principal's office. I get this kind of feeling, which is not a good feeling. But that is perhaps not the taxpayer that we saw, that we had in front of our eyes when we had interaction with this taxpayer. So the result of this study was 3 different attitudes, and all attitudes are within the law. So taxpayers feel like the Swedish tax agency, we follow the law, but we do it in different manners. And the first attitude I'm going to describe to you, we labeled it C. Doesn't really matter, it doesn't stand for anything, it's just a label of an attitude. But this attitude is characterized by us following the law, but at the same time listening to the taxpayer, understanding the taxpayer, trying to be helpful, empathic. And the taxpayers feel like when we meet them with this sort of attitude, where we see them as human beings, they're becoming more relaxed. They feel encouraged to ask their questions. They say that, well, I can come back in another situation, and I feel comfortable with that. It also affects the hierarchy between us and the taxpayers. It feels like we meet more or less equal terms, but we have different roles. So a very human characterized attitude, where we see the difference between the tax case and the human beings. We're not accusing the taxpayer. Another taxpayer, another attitude was an attitude we labeled B. And this attitude is more characterized by the taxpayers not feeling that we see them as human beings. They feel like we see them as the tax case. And when we interact with them, they feel like we don't understand how it is to live in their environment, how it is to be, you sit by your computer and you forget where you were, you're trying to fill in your form, you have kids in the back, etc. We're just like square-minded, stiff, communicated with a complicated language and so on. And when taxpayers perceive this more or less square-sized attitude, very super bureaucratic attitude, they get like nervous, and they think that when I don't understand, it's something wrong with me. So say that they know someone who knows something about taxes. They will call them in the evening instead. Say that, okay, so you have an interaction with the tax agency, but you want to solve your tax issue with someone else instead, but because you don't feel comfortable with the interaction they have with us. So a very, squared attitude, B. Another attitude is more or less the way that I described in the introduction here with the Ingmar Bergman situation, is an attitude where the taxpayers feel judged beforehand. They feel like we see them as cheaters. Even if they haven't done anything, they feel that we communicate in an arrogant way, assuming that they will be non-compliant. And when we use our powers in this way, or taxpayers perceive we use our powers in this way, it could take 2 different directions. One direction is that the taxpayer feels really uncomfortable in this situation, stops listening, trying to get away from this situation. And we have had taxpayers that in later service that we have done said that, well, I perceive this attitude from the Swedish tax agency. It was like 15 years ago. And since that, I have never contacted them. I will never end up in this situation where they treat me this way that I perceived. So they're trying to avoid us. The other reaction is a reaction where taxpayers feel like, you can't treat me this way. I will write to the commissioner, I will go to the press, I will go to court, but the driver is not the tax case or the tax issue. It's more the attitude that they perceived from us. So when it comes to how this attitude affects trust, it was only the first attitude, the C attitude, that had a positive impact on trust. And the next attitude, the B attitude, had a negative impact on trust. And the last attitude, the A attitude, had a very strong impact on trust. So the stronger impact of the A attitude was the impact of the A attitude, the last attitude, was stronger than the positive impact of the C attitude, the first attitude. So how common were these attitudes? Well, back in 2003, it looked like this. 60% of the taxpayers perceived the C attitude, 50% the B attitude, and then 20% the A attitude. And some of you may think that how can this exceed 100%? They're not that skilled in Sweden when it comes to, calculating and so. But the reason is that they overlap each other. So you can feel that you've been treating with the C attitude, but in some situations with the B attitude. After this study was made, we did a study where we asked ourselves, what attitudes do we think that taxpayers perceive that we have? And the answer was not the same. We thought almost up to 90% that, well, taxpayers perceive it perhaps like the C attitude. 4% of the staff said, well, maybe we are seen as these, accusing kind of guys. But the gap between the external perspective and the internal perspective was so important for us, because we could show our staff, and we were carrying out the discussion how we can improve. It was crystal clear that the way we see the world is not the same as how the taxpayers see the world. So this was the base for our strategy. We focused on being helpful based on this study. It changed the way we recruited our staff. In the past, we said that, okay, if you have a degree in tax law, come and work for us. Here are the piles with tax returns. But after this, we said that, well, you also have to have the skill to interact with the taxpayer in a way, in a professional way, where he or she feels comfortable with it. That is being professional. So we're trying to see how we can earn trust in everything we do. We set goals for good taxpayer treatment in 2006. Before that, we didn't have any goals when it comes to taxpayer treatment. Then we are focused more on procedural justice or procedural fairness. I mean, in the past, we really wanted to make sure that we were following the law, that everything was correct according to the law. And that is, of course, very important, but it's not enough in order to earn trust. So some of the explanation how you can like an agency that takes people's money, that some think is peculiar, because that's actually what kind of mission that we have, is the journey towards this decision. And taxpayers, if they perceive the procedures as just and fair, they will accept a decision from us and accept a decision from your tax administration as well, I assume, in a larger degree compared to if they think that this was not characterized by being a good procedure. So there you have the good attitude, you have the taxpayer relation, good treatment, using plain language, everything like this that we are focused on in order to taxpayers that feel that we handle them respectfully, and they feel like you can ask the tax agency anything and they don't blame me with a bad attitude. And we have done a focus shift when it comes to we see non-compliance. Of course, we face non-compliance, but the reason for non-compliance is, of course, very, very important for us to understand. And we thought in the past, we thought that we had to fix the taxpayers. We thought that if you cheat with your taxes, you're like a tax cheater. And we thought that we wanted to identify those taxpayers in order to get it right, to use enforcement activities to find them and correct their behavior. But now we're thinking more about we have to understand the environment. So let's say that we have 10,000 taxpayers from another tax administration, let's say the US, and they come to the Swedish context. We think that perhaps they will adapt to how it is here. How can you be compliant? What are other taxpayers doing, etc. So taxpayers who are part of a context, the context is very, very important. And we understand that the context is, of course, different in different countries. So you have to consider that. But people adapt to others' behavior to a large extent. We do like others do. So therefore, it's very, very important focus shift for us to trying to understand taxpayers' environment. So we can see it as a system. But we think that it's a system that we want to work. So instead of just looking case by case how it works, we try to see it from above, to see that when cars, like in this example, collide, maybe there could be something with the cars or the taxpayers' behavior, if you use that metaphor, but it could also be something wrong with the road. So it could be that taxpayers, it's very, very hard to be compliant. It could be very, very hard to understand how to do it right. Then perhaps we have to fix that instead of, going after each and every taxpayer. So we're trying to see it as a system, and this system should be as pro-compliance as possible. And this journey has been a customer-oriented journey, I would say, where we tried to see how we could create good relations with the taxpayers. But I say that we have put ourselves in the middle, in the sun. So that the Swedish tax agency and we have other taxpayers, and we had goals to create this good relation between us and the taxpayers, us and businesses, us and other agencies, etc. But what we've done in 2017, when we changed our strategic approach, it was that what would it look like if we do not put ourselves in the center? So if we see it from the taxpayer's perspective instead, where the tax agency, we are just one stakeholder among other stakeholders from the taxpayer's perspective, what would it look like then? And then we see from the taxpayer's perspective that we are, of course, an agency. The taxpayer have other agency, they have their employees, the distributors, and all other stakeholders. And what we want to achieve is to make the situation as easy and pro-compliance as possible. And the solution can be that we do not create another e-service. It could be that we see that if something is not working as good as possible for the taxpayers, but we could perhaps cooperate with another agency or another organization, software developers, etc., in order to make this happen. So it's more wider approach than we saw before. And sometimes we involve taxpayers, of course. We have an idea about the solution that we do. And as I said, in the past, we did a lot of e-services. We still have e-services, but we could have something like that. And we want to see, do taxpayers understand this? We do user testing and so on. And let's say that we have this traffic light. Each and everyone understands. It could be like red, orange, green. But it's not enough, because if you put it in the context of the taxpayers, it could be a mess anyway. So the taxpayer said, well, I understand this solution that you provide from the Swedish tax agency, but at the same time, I have to consider another e-service from another agency, etc. And it could be very complex for the taxpayers. when they see it from their situation. So we say it's not enough that each and everything from us is working, it also has to be working in taxpayers' environment. And if it's not, we see how can we adopt in the best way. So we have a lot of cooperation with software developers, etc., because we know that many small businesses, they use this software. So instead of, trying to get them to go to our e-service, maybe we could give some input to these software developers so it works smoothly when a smaller company is running their business from their software. So now I've given you a brief description, brief overview of our change, and our vision that we have is together we make society possible, and we think it's together with others, it's together with you, for example, and we wanted to get it easy, correct, and secure for everyone, and that is from the taxpayer's perspective. So it's not that from our perspective, but our values is that we want to be attentive, innovative, and take responsibility. So thank you for listening to this, and now I will stop sharing my screen and we will get into the reflection part.
Wow, Anders, that was really interesting, and thank you for talking about how the Swedish Tax Agency changed its internal organizational attitude and way of doing things to put the taxpayer at the center of the universe rather than the tax agency at the center of the universe, and to gain the taxpayer's perspective. Since I have the advantage of the floor, I want to ask a very broad question, which is the following. So all of this effort has been great. It sounds very modern, open-minded, taking into account taxpayers' behavior. But at the end of the day, we want to also think about some fundamental questions like, what about the revenue collected? What about the gap? Has the compliance gap been affected? And what about, taxpayer satisfaction? And also the issue of the cost of administering a system from this point of view versus an more enforcement-oriented point of view. So could you say a little bit more about, and here we're talking about how to measure, right? Some way of measuring the outcome of this shift in philosophy and way of working. Could you say a little bit about those 4 different aspects: revenue performance, the overall compliance gap, the cost of administering the system, and also I think what's more obvious is the changes in taxpayer satisfaction and how these are measured, because countries do this very differently, and I think it really does matter how you measure taxpayer satisfaction. Thank you, Anders.
Yes, I'll do that. Thank you so much. And I will start, and you can, ask me during my answer. But I would say it's like a win-win situation. When we have done system changes, like starting to pre-populate information, that has been a shift that we have done. Before we had third-party information in our databases, and it was more or less manual for the taxpayers. They had to fill in the tax return forms, and they went to someone else and paid them for this service. And then when we decided to take the information that we had in our systems and pre-populate them in the forms, it was many years ago now, from our side, we could see that it enhanced the compliance because we got it more right from the start. Most errors that we saw at that time, where we used like audit activities, was that taxpayers, they made mistakes trying to fill in the forms. So that was not like serious non-compliance activities. It was not tax crimes. It was us spending a lot of resources trying to correct that the taxpayers had difficulties to fill in the forms, and we spend a lot of resources doing that. But when we pre-populated this information, we showed our information and we put it on the right places in the forms. Well, we could see that it became more accurate, more right from the start. But the taxpayer's reaction was that it's much more easy now. I can just focus on, see that it is right. I don't have to read all the brochures. I don't have to spend my days trying to figure out how to fill in these complicated forms. And we measure it by, doing studies where we ask taxpayers, what is your experience when you trying to be compliant, trying to access information and so on. And when we do this kind of studies, we do it with a separate part. So no connection between the taxpayer and our systems at all. So they are anonymous. So they really can feel free and really say, if it's super bad, we want to hear that. So we measure it on a yearly basis, that the relation between us and the taxpayers with a third party company that measures that. But then we also measure it when it comes to this kind of like the attitude study. We do more deeper interviews to understand sometimes what is behind. I mean, if you're not satisfied, it could have many reasons because of this. And then we do other like studies like focus groups and interviews. I'm trying to understand more in depth than what is really struggling for taxpayers. So that is also something, and we perceive it's easier to make a change when we get this more deeper understanding. It's easier to use this in order to transform. So that is the taxpayer satisfaction part, and what we can see as more well, it's easier, better. But when it comes to the non-compliance, the tax crime part, we could also see that our tax gap has been closed a little bit, but it's so many things that affect the tax gap. It's the whole economy, you know, it's lots of things, the change of legislation and so on. So our tax gap, we could see that it's less now. But if we look deeper into, like say the situation in certain lines of businesses, the taxi business, the construction business, we could see that this cooperative approach that we have committed, we have compliance with information, we have press seminars, and everything as a whole, we could see that it's a better situation for them. And then it's better to, I mean, trying to see on like a line of business, and to follow that and measure that and ask them and see, do we see a raise of compliance there? And what does it look like, the possibilities to be compliant? So to break it down a little bit, because on a national level, it's not that easy, even if we can see in Sweden that it becomes better, this win-win situation, that we can't see a direct relation between like a good attitude and compliance on a national level, of course. But we could see when we put bits and pieces from, you know, studies and so on, that it really affects the taxpayer's view of us. It affects taxpayers' possibility to access information because we have a higher level of trust now. And it also, we can see that it affects their willingness to be compliant. So most taxpayers in Sweden say that I feel it's my moral obligation to be compliant. And we know that how we treat them really matters when it comes to achieving this. So no, I don't remember. Did I cover all the subjects that you?
Yes, that was pretty comprehensive, and thank you for that. Focusing a lot on the behavioral part, right, and the satisfaction.
Yes.
I have a question for you. I can't help but ask before I go to the other questions quickly. That you brought up that's mentioned in your book, and you've mentioned the taxi, you know, the work on the taxis by the tax administration, which I think was so interesting. But you also mentioned another aspect that many countries are facing that has to do with the shadow economy, or what we in the IMF call the informal economy. And that is segments of the population that decide for whatever reason that they're not going to pay tax, that they're going to remain under the radar, you know, regarding the reporting of the income they're earning. And, you know, that this can become pretty quickly a major headache and vulnerability for the tax system when you have whole groups of taxpayers who are basically outside the system. And in your book, you describe how the tax administration decided to address this in Sweden by linking non-compliance with tax to the impact on the offer of public services. You know, if we don't pay tax, and you had, you know, if I read this correctly in your book, yes, you had these clips about, you know, you're walking through these dirty streets, they're not lit, you know, the streets themselves are not in good shape. and other kinds of the consequences for other public services. And I found that so interesting too, that the administration chose to address a whole, if you will, a whole segment of the population. In this case, I understand it was the younger taxpayers.
Yes.
By saying, hey guys, if you keep this up, you know, this is the kind of, you know, basically country that you are setting yourself up to live in. We can't, it's not only that tax administration takes your money, but it shows up somewhere else as a service. And that link is so vital. Can you just talk very briefly about that?
Sure. It was a long time ago now. I think it was 2003, 4, something like that. We had this kind of campaign. And as you said, we wanted to encourage younger people to think about the connection between taxes and society. And when we started to ask them, we said that, well, this is not like a sexy subject. It's not so much fun to talk about this. And so, but then we tried to do it on young people's terms. And then when describing it as you did, to see the connection between society and taxes, more young people thought that this is really interesting and they wanted to be part of this and reflect upon it. So when we got it started, we really got it going. But this campaign was also criticized from, I mean, some journalists and so on, and some said that, is this a political side or not? But we said that, well, it's part of democracy, really. If you, the type of taxes that we have in Sweden, that is something that you select your politicians and they decide about the taxes. But the connection between taxes and society, that we can talk about. And if you want to change the taxes, that's a political side. But if we want to get it going, we have to discuss and see what the consequences are and so on. And what we can see there is that it comes down, the discussion comes down to more or less human behavior even there. What you feel is fair or unfair. So if people say that, well, I will pay my taxes if I see that others are paying their taxes. But if I'm the last one paying my taxes, I feel that that is unfair. So it's more about fairness, and we consider this when we communicate to taxpayers also, to really see that they feel appreciated, and that we do not accuse them that you're part of a system that is working. And that was a success, this campaign. So you can read more about it in the books, those of you are interested. But we had it for a few years, and we think it's a good thing that we see our role in society as tax administration, and do not bother to take these discussions.
Yes, I see what you're saying. So more focus on how the tax agency interacts itself. Very good. Anders, I have a couple of questions from the audience, and the first is from Uzbekistan. What is the percentage of voluntary payment of taxes in Sweden?
Oh, voluntary payment of taxes. When it comes to the taxes determined, I think it's 99.6% or something like that. So most taxes determined are paid. So we have very few or very little part of the tax determined that is not paid. But that is, of course, not the same as the tax gap or tax. So we have an informal economy, and that is not tax determined, sort of, but the majority of people in Sweden, I would say, that pay their taxes and they are compliant. But we, as any tax administration, we could see that there are some problems with undeclared incomes. You have cryptocurrency, and you have other people just paid cash to someone else and stuff like that. That is sometimes part of the, you have the ordinary business, and you have that like an extra income. So we have non-compliance, but when it comes to tax determined, this is very, very high compliance rate when it comes to payment.
Thank you, Anders. And going back to your very original point about service, there's a question that is the following: what if supporting taxpayers is construed or understood as aiding and abetting?
I don't really understand the question. Can you?
So what if helping taxpayers is understood or interpreted as being on the taxpayer side when their behavior is bad, and condoning non-compliant kinds of behaviors? I think that's what that question is trying to get at.
Okay, very good. Thank you for explaining it to me. I mean, when we did this attitude study, some had the idea that if we meet a taxpayer who are non-compliant, should we perhaps use this A attitude, being accusive, if we know that someone is non-compliant? And we ended up that no one should get a punishment from us, an agency, with a bad attitude. I mean, the consequence is a consequence of the law. So even if we have like a tax case where we suspect a tax crime or tax criminal activities, we still use the C attitude. So we would say that, well, if you want us to explain how you can take this to court, or you want us to explain the decision here, please contact us. We are available. And we don't want to accuse the taxpayers in this situation. And this is very, very important, I think, because otherwise the taxpayers will feel like we see them as bad persons. So we're it's very important that when we communicate, is the tax situation and the tax case. And why we do this is, of course, that is part of what we think is good treatment, but also that we see that it gives best possibilities for these taxpayers to perhaps becoming more compliant in the future. Because if we behave very accusing to them, we will become the opponent. That is typical human behavior. Someone is, angry with me, I will be angry back. We will be seen as the bad guys. We don't want to create this tension. So therefore, we use the attitude, no matter if it's like a tax crime situation or like an ordinary service situation.
Very interesting.
If that was,
yes, very interesting response, Anders. So you're basically saying that it's not really dependent on the actual case, because you want to have this general fair approach to the taxpayer, and then the rules, the application of the rules themselves will then play out. In other words, will determine the consequences.
Yes. It's the same if someone is going to court. I mean, the judge will greet anyone, even if you are accused, you should feel as welcome, because the court should be like independent. So you shouldn't mix that up. And that, I think that is very, very important, that each and everyone should feel like welcome. And we don't blame when it comes to these actions in a way that you feel like a bad human being. That will never become a good thing in the long run, even if the consequences could be severe, of course. Right.
I want to take one last question, Anders, and kind of combine with one I have. And a lot of attention is being paid on the role of technology in allowing tax administrations to be more service-oriented. So, but my question includes that: what role has technology played versus this change of attitude within the organization to become more along behavior of tax officials and the whole tax agency to support more the C model than the A and B model that you explained? So what could you say is the balance between, or the role of technology and this behavioral and attitudinal change within the organization for it to become more service-oriented?
Yes, I would say that it's a combination. I mean, if we have used the use of technology in the more like A attitude manners, I don't think that taxpayers would perceive us as providing good service. So it's a combination of using technology, but at the same time understanding how it will end up in the taxpayer's daily business or daily life, actually. So, and as I said, we tried to see, can we remove like obstacles? Can we take care of what is really hard for taxpayers? Maybe use technology to pre-populate, to give just accurate information, not too much information as we did in the past. we had brochures that were like 100 pages thick, and the taxpayers was like, oh my God, I don't understand, I don't want to spend time, reading this. And we end up with a situation that we all, I think, recognize these situations. We could see that some taxpayers, they couldn't use their rights because they didn't want to spend the effort looking through this information. So technology can also be used in a way that we facilitate, so it's the right information to you based on your situation. And we still want to use technology and information in a way that we don't, put it on the shoulders of the taxpayers too much. So I'd say it's a combination by using technology in combination with this approach of doing something for the taxpayers and for the pro-compliance environment. I know that you have to go,
No,
Catherine, so I would love to talk more about this, but maybe another day.
But thank you for that response, Anders, because I think that's a very nice way of putting it. We're putting a whole lot of stock on technology, and basically you're saying it's only part of the story. You have to do, you have to put technology and the role of technology and digitalization in service provision into a broader context, and think of the taxpayer. So I think that idea, I think you left us with today, which is really the core, is think about the taxpayer and look at what you're doing from the taxpayer's perspective, which is easy to say and hard to do. So I want to thank you so much. It's been a fascinating presentation and discussion. I want to really encourage everyone to read Anders' book and his colleague. It's called From Senior Tax Collector to Popular Service Agency. I read it yesterday in anticipation of our chat today, and it is a very easy and interesting read, and it has a lot of really good messages and lessons from Sweden's experience, the Swedish tax agency's experience. I want to thank you so much, Anders, for sharing your time and your tax administration's experience with us today. And it's really been a delightful to hear from you, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah, likewise, and thank you so much. And on behalf of the Swedish Tax Agency, we're so happy that we had the opportunity to be part of this. And we think that people are all around the world, even if we live in different contexts and our tax bases are in different contexts, we face more or less the same challenges, and therefore it's so valuable. So thank you for creating this opportunity, sharing ideas. So it has been a pleasure. So thank you so much.
Annette, I'll let the last word for you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much, Catherine, for joining us today. Anders, thank you very much for joining us today. Any questions from our audience that have been unanswered, we'll be sending them over to Anders, and hopefully he can answer them for us through a TED soundbite. So we encourage our audience to please subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up to date with anything TDOT, and also join us on LinkedIn. Thank you so much again, Anders. Catherine, I think 1 hour is just not enough for such an engaging conversation. So let's see what the future brings, and if there are other opportunities to bring the two of you back together to continue this very rich discussion. So with that, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and thank you for joining us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Anders. Bye.
Bye-bye.